Well, it occurred to me I've had this car for about 6 years now. I've worked on it off and on for about 3 years, and I've driven it maybe 300 yards in that time. But in all that time of working on this car, one thing I never have really gone over or explained is what the goal is with this car and what I'm trying to work towards with it. So the main reason I have this car, and the main reason I bought it, was to have something to do. This is my main hobby. I like working on stuff. And at the time that I bought this, the 68 GMC was more or less done. And that was fall of 2017, and since then, the 68 GMC really hasn't needed anything right up until Christmas Day 2023 when I blew the diff up. But excluding that, it hasn't really been a constant source of work. Whereas this car is nothing but a source of work. So that was the first reason I have this car, is to give me something to work on. So my original intent when I bought this car is I mostly bought it because I really like the body style of these cars. I really like the large round headlights tucked into the fenders and the kind of fastback look that the back has. And I really liked this one in particular because it was a 5-speed manual with T-tops. So my original plan with the car was I was going to get it somewhat reliably sound and then just drive it while I worked on it and fixed it and made it better. That way I could get a little enjoyment out of it. What ended up actually happening was almost a week after I bought the car, I got to put it around the neighborhood a few times and that was it. The original distributor failed. I believe it was the magnet in the distributor. I bought 3 different distributors and every single one of them had a different problem that meant it wouldn't work. And I tried different ignition modules, I tried different pickups.
So I got the little jump box going, and I think where the auto industry has gone wrong for like the last century is they haven't done the stacked distributor mod yet. So the original 281 is sitting down there, this HEI one's sitting on top of it with a ignition module that doesn't go to this distributor or that one, all tied up to the hood, and this vice grip that's also grounding the spark plug to the whatever PCV tube. So yeah, that's all hooked up to this little ratty push button here with the coil just sitting on top of the intake. But now it has spark.
The last time this car ran was because I was able to shoehorn an old HEI magnet into it just as a temporary solution for troubleshooting, and that was the last time that this car had a running engine in it.
And I've had all kinds of problems with it. I don't want to get into that right now. That'll be a whole nother deal. But as you can see by the oil that is thrown all over the engine bay and the hood, it did run a while ago. And I'm going to try and get it to do it again before it probably inevitably breaks. Okay, so the computer isn't actually hooked up to the engine, so it's not going to be doing anything with the fuel. But I'm just going to try and see if I can get it to do what it did earlier.
And that solution proved to be temporary because after it ran for a little bit, it broke the magnet and started having the same problems again. So at that point, I was fed up with the car to the point I actually tried selling it at a loss. I just wanted to get rid of it, and I was honest about how much rust it had whenever I listed it, and because of that, I couldn't even get rid of it at a loss. So I committed to working on it. I figured I had nothing to lose. So I pulled the L28 out, the original 5-speed out, sold both of those, and got all my money back out of the car that I originally spent on it. So from there, we started the project. And so the first step of starting this project was laying out the actual goal, because there's no point in putting a bunch of time and effort into something if you don't know what you're working towards. So the goal for this car is I wanted it to be a really good GT or Grand Touring car. Basically meaning I wanted it to have respectable performance and handling, be comfortable to ride in, and the car needed to be capable of long distance driving. That's pretty much the three main things that this car needed to do. So the first thing is the car needed to be visually appealing, both interior and exterior. So the exterior, I already liked the body style, so we were good there. The problem is this car had, from the rear subframe to the front, rust. I have no less than 20 some odd patches in this car. This car had a significant amount of rust. Not necessarily a lot of rust for one of these cars, but just in general it had a lot of rust. So I actually learned how to weld sheet metal and how to do rust repair on this car, and it was a pretty good experience because it had so much of it. As far as appearances go, the real challenge has been the interior. Which, there's not much of the interior in it right now, but so far what I've had to deal with is the gauges. So the original gauges were not really going to work for my application. So I ended up having to go with aftermarket gauges, which was kind of a challenge because I want the gauges to match the general tone or vibe of the car. And most aftermarket gauges that I could find didn't do that until I found some gauges made by the company Intellitronics. They were green digital universal gauges, and I spent a whole lot of time custom 3D printing brackets for them and getting them mounted up in the original Nissan gauge clusters. And what I ended up with is a gauge set that looks almost factory, in my opinion. I mean, at a glance, if somebody didn't know any better, they would potentially assume that they were the original gauges, which is really what I wanted out of the car. And I really wanted the green digital gauges of some kind with like these have a bar graph on them that I really like, because that was just digital gauges from the 80s and 90s. I just always thought it looked cool, so I wanted to recreate that. The other problem I had was the HVAC controls. So the original HVAC controls operated off of vacuum. And my parents have two later Model 300Zs, and those cars have had nothing but problems with those vacuum canisters because at this point they're well over 30 years old and they leak. So I didn't want to get this car together and then immediately have the same problems. So I converted it all to a mechanical setup, which again took a whole lot of time, but hopefully it'll prove to be reliable. Part of the challenge with that, though, was trying to make it aesthetically appealing and match the rest of the interior. So for all the knobs came off of 280ZX cars. So I did that to try and make it look right, and then I blacked out the bezel, and the backlight is green to try and make it look of the era. So those were the two big challenges there. The rest of the interior is also going to be a challenge, just haven't gotten there yet. The other criteria that I alluded to earlier is this car needs to have respectable performance. Now, the L28 has two problems for me that take it out of the plan for success. The first problem is parts. At least in my neck of the woods, there really is no parts support for these cars or the L28. I have, I think, 4 major parts store chains in my area with no less than a dozen stores total. And the only part I could get for the original L28 same day was the oil filter. So again, with this car, if I want to drive it to different cities, different places, if it breaks down, I want to have the best chance of fixing it and getting parts for it. So the L28 was out because of that reason. But also, performance-wise, the L28 was just never going to really do what I wanted it to. I mean, in its day, it was probably pretty decent, but the problem is I want this car to be, respectable within reason by today's standards. And the L28 wasn't going to do that without a lot of modification, and again, parts are hard to come by, and then the cost of doing that just was kind of cost prohibitive compared to swapping in a different engine. So as far as the specifics of the performance, the car has to do better than a 16 in the quarter mile. That's a pretty low bar, but the 68 GMC will do a 16.7 in the quarter mile. So the old sports car better be faster than the pickup. So with the V8, it'll definitely be able to do that. With the L28, it would have been like a low 17. So the L28 was also out for performance reasons. So another consideration with this engine swap is weight. So a V8 is going to weigh more than the L28. However, at least as far as I can tell from shipping figures that people have posted, a dressed out small block 350 is going to weigh maybe 50 pounds more than a dressed out L28. Yeah, the L28 is smaller, but it's an inline 6. So the V8 is able to, share more structural components between cylinders, whereas the inline 6 can't. So another consideration with the weight of the engine is where is that center of gravity located? So the front of the L28 would have been somewhere up here. The V8 though, the front of the engine is pushed further back. In fact, the center of gravity of this engine is well behind the center line of the front wheels. And the front of the engine is almost behind the center line of the front wheels. I mean, by definition, this thing is almost mid-engine because almost the entire engine is between the wheelbase. So, yes, the engine weighs more, but its weight is pushed further back in the car. So as far as the handling goes, I don't think the handling will really be that effective. So as far as what engine is going in this, it's going to be a Chevy 350 Generation 1 small block of some kind. Don't exactly know what the specs of it are. It should make somewhere in the neighborhood of 350 at the crank, maybe closer to 400, but don't know the specs of it yet. So another consideration is I want the car to have respectable handling. So again, Nissan built this as a sports car, so thankfully they pretty much did all the work for me. This car was built to have kind of decent, sporty performance, but it was also designed to be more comfortable than its predecessors. So that is pretty much perfect for me. All I did was rebuild the suspension. I put new bushings and everything, new sway bar links, and I rebuilt and replaced the struts as needed. So as far as the handling goes, the car in stock form should be plenty adequate. And again, I don't expect that the added weight of the engine is really going to upset the handling much because the weight is pushed further back in the car. And also, since I want this car to be good at long distance driving, it needs to be comfortable. So thankfully, Nissan kind of set this car up to do that from the factory. The 280ZX was a cushier version of the 280. So it also had more interior space and more luxuries in it. This car in particular was a GL, the Grand Luxury model. So as far as luxuries go, really all that this car needs is air conditioning, a heater, and cruise control and decent stereo. All of those things are feasible for this car, and we'll start picking those apart as the project progresses. The rest of the interior, as far as the seats and stuff, is just going to go right back to stock because that ought to be plenty adequate. So, a consideration with the car being comfortable that proved to be a bit of a challenge. This car, like I said, originally had a 5-speed manual transmission, which means that it has an R200 rear differential. That is good in the fact that the R200 is the better diff, it's the stronger diff. The bad news is this R200 in particular has a 390-to-1 rear gear. So what that means is this engine, if this car is traveling at 80 miles an hour, with these tires, which are 24 inches tall, it's about as big of a tire as this car will accept without the tire getting into the strut, traveling at 80 miles an hour, if this car has no overdrive, the engine is going to be running 4,400 RPM at 80 miles an hour, which is unacceptable by any standard. It's going to be real hard on fuel, really hard on the engine, and really loud. So any kind of 3-speed or 4-speed manual is pretty much out of the question. So the car needs overdrive. But even if you just get a 700, something like a 700 R4, it has a 0.69 to 1 overdrive gear ratio. That, in the same conditions, is still going to put the engine at 3,000 RPM, which is better, but that's still significantly more than what I want to have to live with. It's still going to be noisy, it's going to be hard on fuel, it's going to be kind of hard on the engine. That's still more excessive than I want to deal with. So I needed to find a 6-speed is really what this car needed. So thankfully I was lucky enough to find one. I knew a guy who had a burned out Corvette that had a 6-speed manual. I was able to work out a deal with the guy, and after very delicately removing the transmission from the crispy Corvette, well darn. Excellent. Started looking at it, and it is a ZF S640. It's the black tag transmission, which is apparently the most desirable one. So the good news is that transmission is, again, a 6-speed. It's a double overdrive. So 6th gear is a 0.5 to 1 ratio, which puts the engine in the same conditions as before at 2,200 RPM. So that's 2,200 RPM at 80 miles an hour. That is plenty decent. That'll be just fine. The engine's not going to be turning a whole lot of excess RPM. It'll be better on fuel. 2,200 RPM is good. The bad news of that transmission is it's purpose-built for the Corvette, and specifically a 1994 Corvette, and it does not fit well into the 280ZX whatsoever, which that will be evident in a future video. But the effort of getting this transmission into this car will be worth it by it being able to cruise on the highway at 2,200 RPM. The effort will be worth it for that. So just to kind of sum it up, the goal of this car is I want something that would be ideal for an activity like Power Tour. I want it to be really good on the highway, capable of extended drives, and I want it to be reasonably comfortable for whoever's in it to do those drives. I also want it to have respectable performance and handling as well, and be something that I can easily live with. I want parts to be relatively easy to deal with, and I want it to be relatively easy for me to work on. So that's basically where I'm trying to get the car. That's kind of the purpose behind everything that I've done with it. I imagine several things that I've done haven't really made a whole lot of sense, but hopefully that clears up some of those things. So just going to keep working on it, and hopefully someday we'll be driving it, doing something fun with it. Anyways, thanks for watching.